Here we
that
go.
floats on a sea of red ink, that mutilates little boys and girls, that marries dudes to one
It's
another.
going to get spicy.
And that walks around like it is the civilizational equivalent of the smartest guy in the room, while at the same time being the one that is always bumping into walls and knocking over vases.
Let me just stop for a second and talk about the design of Canon Press and their videos and stuff. I guarantee you a lot of you guys wouldn't know who Doug Wilson was if it wasn't for some great design. Okay. Like just like that logo and the intro and stuff looks cool. It looks cool. Their stuff always looks cool. And whoever is behind like their marketing and their design stuff, they're really like the winner there for Moscow and why anyone even knows who they are. I don't think if John Piper's like design team was doing stuff for Doug Wilson, you wouldn't know who Doug Wilson was.
Introduction. As I've been observing the debate over Christian nationalism, develop is not really the right verb. Stagger is more like it. As I've watched the debate over Christian nationalism stagger around, perhaps toward resolution, a few thoughts have occurred to me from time to time. Actually, one basic thought has occurred to me over and over and over again, and so naturally I thought I should tell you about it. When men from disparate backgrounds and perspectives all seem to be sharing the same fundamental misunderstanding, some of them innocently and others not so much, it makes me want to speak to that misunderstanding. I've seen it in Michael O'Fallon, James Lindsay, Tim Bailey, Michael Horton, Scott Clark, and D.G. Hart. There's one common misconception running underneath all of their criticisms of a Christian prince, and so I thought to address it here. I'm going to attempt to put this response of mine in a nutshell, but what is more likely to happen is I shall wind up putting the same response into a handful of different nutshells. But it doesn't really matter which nut you pick first. It is all the same basic point anyhow, and that is why they all taste like sweet walnut.
Again, you wouldn't know who Doug Wilson was if it wasn't for the design team. I am so tired. Let me give you, like, this is like people complain about me with this. So, like, I get it. It's hypocritical, but come on, man. All these metaphors is, we're going to, the shell, and we're going to get into another shell, and the shell's going to be inside that shell. It's this Russian nesting doll of shells. It's, oh, my goodness. Just say what you want to say, man. Like, we need some John Mayer in here. Just say what you want to say.
And I might as well give you the bottom line now. By what standard? The voice of the Lord. All ethical judgments, in order to be ethical judgments, require transcendental grounding. Otherwise, they are not ethical judgments at all, but rather just the opinions of some guy, or maybe some other guy. In James Lindsay's case, they are just the burbling of certain protoplasmic chemicals, reacting as they always would under these conditions and at this temperature. Whatever the case, they have no authority over me at all. Neither do they have any authority over us being the body politic. Again, in order to be an ethical assessment at all, it requires transcendental authority. In short, there's no ethical authority whatever without a thus saith the Lord. Our secularist experiment functioned for a time as though we could do without his word, but this was merely a sensation, akin to the sensation of flying that was felt by some inventor kid with Batman wings who jumped out of the hayloft. So, ethical judgments require an ultimate standard, but this necessarily includes all ethical assessments of the dire threat posed by Christian nationalism. In short, you can run, but you can't hide. Christian nationalism is the view that we cannot order our corporate lives together without reference to the divine. We cannot govern ourselves appropriately without reference to God. We need him. That is the view. That is what we are saying. The retort to this view, the misunderstanding mentioned at the top, is frequently wrapped up with various examples drawn from the long and sinful history of the first Christendom, the Spanish Inquisition, the Salem witch trials, the 30 Years' War, the 12th century pogroms in London and York, all overseen in some way or other by various Christian princes. So given their record, why are we so hot for Christian princes? Hey?
Fair. Like, this is such like saying like, all right, well, it's never worked before. So, like, people are upset that we're talking about maybe trying it again. And it's like, like, we have the Crusades. Like, what was that all about? It was really about political power for Christianity. Like, you can go all throughout church history, and whenever it becomes a thing about nations, Like once it goes away from like organizations and the focus of the church, which isn't to make the nations, like the governments, like those nations Christian. It's to make all people of every nation Christian, to make them into followers of Jesus, disciples. Whenever it happens and you're like, okay, it's about the nation and getting like the king, make them Christian. Well, what are they going to do? Well, they're just going to go and persecute some other people. Like it keeps on happening. You know, whether it's like Christians in these like political positions of power who, you know, say that they're Christians, they claim Christian virtues and say, you know, I'm a devout follower of Jesus. Oftentimes when it's like that leader who is saying that that should be what's happening for everybody, when that happens, it usually means that that's at the expense of others, so that other religions are being persecuted. Obviously very against what the Bible would say for anyone who would be in charge. I'm a Baptist. As a Baptist, I believe that there is a separation of church and state. I see that clearly in at least New Testament principles. So, like, obviously, I'm going to be against that. And that's, if you're a Baptist, you can't actually be theonomist. You can't be a Christian nationalist. You just can't. It's definitions. Like, it's part of who you are if you're a Baptist. If you're not that, you're not a Baptist. But it's interesting to hear him say, like, okay, well, just because it's never worked before, you know, these people are saying we shouldn't try it. That's essentially his argument. Maybe one of the weakest arguments I've ever heard. Like, just listen to where he goes with this.
It seems like a tough question, but the problem is that there's no real way to bring these historical charges against Christian nationalists without assuming the legitimacy of Christian nationalism. Did Christ disapprove of these outrages? And if he did, then isn't our complaint against these Christian princes the fact that they were being disobedient, that they weren't being Christian enough, that their Christian nationalism didn't go far enough? But if you go the other
this is why I wanted to watch this video and to do it in its context. So you see, like, if I were to just take that clip, people would get so mad at me. But you see, he's building up this argument of it's never worked before, but the reason why it's never worked before is because it wasn't good enough. Maybe this time we'll do it good enough and that'll solve all our problems. As if, like, you know how to do it. like let's just deal with this thing and say hypothetically it could possibly happen, which it never could. At least where North America is right now, it ain't happening for the next 100 years. There's no kind of, like, these are very small movements. It's not going to have that much sway. But let's go with these guys and say that they got big dreams, and we're going to support their big dreams and say that this thing can come true for them. All right. What they're trying to say then is, because just because it's gone bad every single other time, which, let me say that one more time, every single other time, just because it's happened every other time doesn't mean that it's going to happen to us. We're different. That's essentially their argument, is saying that we're different than all those other guys. What makes you different? Like, why do you think that you will not fall for any of the traps of those other people? Even if you think, all right, let's assume, which I'm not saying is the case, let's assume that each one of these Christian nationalists today has the best of intentions, and they sincerely mean that they just want God to be in charge of the nation, right? Like, that's what they say. All right, let's go with that and say that they have every great intention with that. And let's say that some of these other guys in the past, that they did too, right? If we're going to give these guys the benefit of the doubt, I think we have to do that with the past too. What's to say these guys aren't going to fall into the same trap as those other guys? What makes these guys today all that much different than, you know, whoever was in charge during the Crusades? What makes them so different? There's nothing, right? You're just saying it is like, who just put it? Sam just put in the arrogance. Yeah. The arrogance to think that you are so much different than every other human that has ever come before you, at least every other Christian human, to say that we won't get it wrong. Like, to say, like their argument to people saying, like, well, it's gone bad every other time, is for them to be like, well, we just won't. And we're supposed to trust you with that? Let's, again, hypothetically, whether they could accomplish this thing, like, let's give it to them. We're supposed to just trust you and say like, oh, of course, he's just, well, did you hear him? He said he's not going to do it like those guys. Oh, okay. Well, then all the dangers are gone, right? Like, it's just craziness.
What gets me, James Lindsay is an atheist who is distressed by living Christian nationalists because they are supposedly abandoning the ethos of the founders, consequently posing a threat to his liberties, when the fact is that back then he would have had a lot less freedom of cultural engagement than he does now. He opposes contemporary Christian nationalists because they threaten to take him back to the era of his heroes. He thinks he is lionizing James Madison when he is actually lionizing Earl Warren, bringing
like, did you hear it? Did you hear it? People are talking about this Michael Flynn video that's going around. Maybe that's what was being referenced earlier, like that Christian nationalism video that was going around. There's this Flynn video that's going around of him basically saying you need to put your Bible down. These pastors need to put their Bibles down, read the Constitution. It was founded on biblical principles. One kind of. I'll give him that. Like, it is kind of founded on biblical principles, some things. All right. But it's more founded on capitalism and individuality. But regardless, like, there are some biblical principles. But what he's saying is like, well, the fact that we could even have this conversation is because of Christian nationalism. The founders were not Christian nationalists. And you don't get to just take people from a place in history and pluck them into your conversation because it's convenient for you. Like, they weren't Christian nationalists. They were, well, depending on your perspective. I live in Canada, and I've always held this position. I don't think it was right for the American Revolution to happen the way that it did. And especially for, these heroes of pastors to preach to their men to go to war in their churches every Sunday. And now they're looked at as heroes, and there's statues of them everywhere. Like that, nah. But they weren't like, God needs to be in control of this country. It was, hey, taxes are dumb. Like, hey, a government being able to tell us what we can do when they're so far away and they don't know what we're actually dealing with. Like, that's wrong. Like, they weren't Christian nationalists, and they definitely weren't like these guys now.
The absolute down within reach. Okay, we filled up one or two nutshells. Let's come at this another way. Is Christian nationalism bad? A lot of people are acting like it is bad. But who says? By what standard? What is the...
All of history. These things are just so circular. Basically, what Doug Wilson and these Christian nationalists are trying to do is to say, well, you shouldn't, like, let's throw out history. Let's throw out history. And then by what standard? And then you go like, well, if you take out every other occurrence of where this has happened, I guess we can't say that it's bad. Like, of course, if you take all of history out and you go like, well, now deal with it in a hypothetical world. We don't live in that hypothetical world. We live in history. We live in a timeline, to put it in comic book terms, where it's gone bad every other time. So don't do this of like, oh, it's by what standard? Everything that has ever happened. How about that standard?
Basis for making moral judgments about any political system, whatever. If the standard of judgment originates from some location below the transcendental ceiling, then the only authority it possesses is that of power. That is why our secularist overlords are acting the way they do. Shut up, they explain. To channel the late Francis Schaeffer, if there is no absolute over society, then society becomes the absolute. But speaking frankly, between us girls, as I look around at this dog's breakfast of a culture, I am disinclined to make it my absolute.
Between us girls? What a weird joke.
I don't want an absolute that floats on a sea of red ink, that mutilates little boys and girls, that marries dudes to one another, and that walks around like it is the civilizational equivalent of the smartest guy in the room, while at the same time being the one that is always bumping into walls and knocking over vases.
That's not the only two options, Doug. Like, what?
No! It's just dumb.
Just to basically be like, well, either you're for Christian nationalism or you want all the liberalism. You want every sin that's in the Bible to be legal. No, that's not what you like. Moderate positions exist. These guys always want to deal with extremes, and it's a straw man that he's building, but it's also just something that they constantly do. And that's part of being an extremist, is that you always assume the other person is on the extreme side. So, like, all right, well, if you're not for Christian nationalism, then you're for the devil being president? Like, come on.
Instead of talking nonsense. Now, our critics could evade the force of this reasoning by leaning in and owning it. They could say something like, yes, well, Christian nationalism is actually a noble ideal, and your points about its being an inescapable reality are well taken. But our problem...
Actually, no, it's not a worthwhile idea, because it's not theologically sound. Because what they've done to accomplish this thing of political power that they want to achieve is that they've basically ripped apart the Great Commission. The Great Commission has become about organizations, institutions, and governments rather than souls. Now, I know that they would say, like, that's not true, you're being so mean to us. But at the end of the day, that's what they want. And maybe it's to a means of a soul, but you're now separating things to where the main goal, that like the goal that you're achieving in your lifetime, is about governments and institutions and organizations and power and influence, rather than the souls that live down the street or that are across the street from you right now. Like those souls, or maybe even in your family. Like they want you to be like, no, it's about this, so that you can reach those souls. How about you just, become friends with those people and have influence in their life? And maybe they'll start voting a certain way because they see things through the lens of Scripture. Maybe that's how you can gain influence. But, call me old-fashioned.
Problem is actually with you Christian nationalists. Your noble cause deserves better champions. We don't trust you. You speak as though the secular order is coming apart at the seams, and you are positioning yourselves to assume responsibility and rule once that disintegration is complete. That's as may be, but we think that you guys are singularly ill-equipped to do anything like that. We think you could not run a taco stand, much less assume responsibility for the restoration of Western civilization, or other hurtful words to that effect.
I wouldn't put it in that way, but yes. Like, I don't trust Doug Wilson. Like, Google Doug Wilson and controversy, and you come back to me and say, like, yes, let's put everything into this person's hands. He's not our Christian prince, yo.
Much as we regret how this would have descended to personalities, it at least has the advantage of not being incoherent. And one would see their point, of course, if only they would make it. If you would give me a minute, I bet I could round up some Christian nationalists who specialize in idiot memes and who think that what America needs right now is the dynamism of a Bonaparte, only a Christian one. But it will not do to read one or two such memes from the fringe and then pretend that that is what Stephen Wolfe was advocating in a book they didn't read. A common retort from our side, and one that lands on the jaw, is this: do the reading. But
buy the book. It's so weird to hear it, from one of the main guys who owns these things. Just like, oh, you didn't read the book. No, because the title of the book is Christian or A Case for Christian Nationalism, something like that. Like, no, I'm not going to read that book. No, like it's like, oh, you just think this thing is crazy because you haven't read it. What is the book called? It's called Crazy.
Instead of making that point, which would at least be intelligible, we get things like this from D.G. Hart. When I look at that, I'm not quite sure where to look. It makes me want to not make eye contact with anybody.
This is where I go, these guys who think that Doug Wilson is such like a wordsmith, and I think he even has a book about that. Like, just, can I quickly, like, it's 7:12. Let's go back. I want you to listen to just how he puts this metaphor, okay?
D.G. Hart. When I look at that, I'm not quite sure where to look.
When I look at that, I don't know where to look. At that? Like, he's not a... I don't mean to just, like, belittle the guy now, but, like, these guys, they lift him up like, oh, he's a philosopher more than a pastor. No, this ain't no Schaefer, okay?
It makes me want to not make eye contact with anybody. This Christian gentleman is telling us the story of Daniel's 3 friends getting pitched into the furnace, and is seriously maintaining that we have to keep in mind that Nebuchadnezzar was perfectly within his ordained rights to throw them in there. This is a new take on Bible stories indeed. John Stott once said that fuzzy thinking was one of the sins of the age. We have to do better. To the critics of Christian nationalism, I would urge three things upon you. First, do the reading. Fight with
No.
what we are actually arguing for and not with what might be an easier position to refute. Second, don't charge us with advocating for things that we abhor as much as you do. And third, if you object
I think that's actually fair. Like advocating, like don't put that on them for things that they're not saying. I agree with that.
to our only apparent surrender to the balkanization of America, you can't fight that by accelerating the balkanization of the conservative Christian resistance.
And by the book. Oh boy.